I've just been asked to say where we came from, etc., what I do now, and what I did possibly prior to taking the Duke. Well, I used to work on the newspapers, printing the newspapers in London. I was apprenticed to, used to work on the People and the Daily Herald and Sporting Life and lots of other newspapers and magazines. Were made redundant from the newspaper world and ended up in Shoreham, where I worked for a short time. Once again made redundant, and I'd always painted since my honeymoon. I started on my honeymoon, and I walked past the shop in East Street, Artists and Framers, and it was up for sale as far as I can remember, although I don't think there was a premium on the lease. The old lady who had it was just leaving. So I decided to take a chance and start a picture framing business and a small gallery. That's 33 years ago. I'm still here. I've grown old in this place. My wife was a nurse, and my two sons, well, they didn't do anything other than run the Duke for us, and I can only say I think they did a pretty good job. Well, I'm part of a quartet. My wife and I. Are you recording now? Oh, sorry. My wife and I and Darren Lee, Trevor and Claire. So we had 4 children, but it was just Darren Lee who helped us to run the pub, and we're very much part of the pub. At the moment I'm picture framing and painting, which is what I was doing when we had the pub as well, and a lot of people who know the Duke will know that I painted pop stars to put up in the pub, and hopefully they were appreciated. I think they were. Wendy and I took over the pub in 15th of July 1985. It wasn't the easiest pub in the world to take over, as one taxi driver said to us when we took it over. He said, "We don't collect from the Duke, it's too dangerous," which actually didn't instill us with a lot of confidence. But it turned out to be true to some extent, because the clientele that we took over were a mixed bunch really, of local families, local vendettas, local friends, people who had grown up in Shoreham all their lives and saw the Duke as their pub. Whoever owned it, it was theirs in their opinion. So we had to contest with them for ownership of the pub to begin with. Very difficult to give you the feel of the Duke and the atmosphere and the flavour of it in those days, but it was certainly not like pubs today. There were no plasma, no tellies and that sort of. Probably the best way to describe the pub was a few incidents really. I have to pay tribute to my son Darren, who ran the pub from 11 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon. He was only a lad of about 18, but on his own behind the bar he had to deal with people that were twice his age. Some of them were rogues, likeable rogues, some of them were not very likeable rogues, and they did as much as they could to make his life quite difficult at times. So I pay homage to his courage to deal with that. He was telling me that in the early days he was happened to be down there on one Sunday night, and the door opened and a large chap came in, very big chap who he happened to know, so he wasn't too concerned about the fact. But the other chap, who was twice as big as him, and as Darren said, he frightened the life out of him. He appeared to be covered with dust and made of cement because he looked so hard. The evening went on, and at 9:30, 9:45 on a Sunday night, when we closed at 10:30, this chap said to Darren, "What time do you close?" Darren said 10:30. He said, "No, you don't." And he left it at that. So that was the type of thing that Darren had to deal with. Just one other incident, Sunday on a midday during the week. Chap sat at the bar, he pulled out a gun and put it on the counter and said, "Do you mind if I leave that there? There are people after me and they may come here to get me." He said, "At least I'll stand a chance if I've got a gun." Darren dealt with it however he did, and things passed by reasonably well. But so that was the type of clientele that we had. People who would keep you talking on one side of the bar while their mates went round the other side, and started putting their hands over the bar and nicking bottles of beer and putting them out of the window of the gents' toilet to their mates who were waiting outside. It was entertaining, interesting, and in many ways I miss it really, and I think we all do. Time moved on and we got rid of this sort of clientele, and for that I have to thank Dolly Dagger, because if there's any way to get rid of somebody who wants to make a nuisance of themselves in the pub, create a situation where they can't be heard, and that's exactly what Dolly Dagger did. And thanks to Rod Cameron, John Finch and Phil on the bass, to some extent I think they saved our lives quite often. But of course one clientele changes into another clientele, and with the Dolly Dagger band and Hendrix along came the bikers. I'll just give you one story about the bikers. It was one Friday early in the evening, waiting for Dolly Dagger to turn up and set up, and there were about 30 or 40 of our locals in the pub, and we heard roaring outside, and it was a group of bikers that had turned up that looked a bit like the Waffen SS had arriving. Big blokes all dressed in black, chains, tattoos, swastikas, skull and crossbones, beards and German helmets. So they all came in, about 15 of them. There was only Darren and his mate who was the barman that evening to deal with them. Within 10 minutes all the customers had left, so we were left with just 15 the bikers, who we'd served and sat on the opposite side of the bar leering at us, waiting for something to happen. The slight problem was that Darren's mate, Chris Cook, he had this terrible habit of when he felt scared he would grin, and so Chris Cook would lean across the bar grinning at these bikers, and Darren said to him, "For Christ's sake, stop grinning, Chris. They think you're taking the piss out of them." And with that they got up and moved towards the bar, at which point Chris ran out of the bar, out the little back door and up into our quarters, where my wife Wendy was ironing in the bedroom. He burst into the bedroom with a face like a sack of flour, white and grinning, and dived under our bed. The bikers split forces, and one went round one side of the bar and the other lot went round the other side of the bar, hoping to meet Chris by the gents' toilet. Of course by that time he'd disappeared, and they were somewhat like a cat had lost a mouse, because they ran around all over the place looking for him. Of course that left Darren to deal with them. Well, they eventually got bored because they realised they were the only ones in the pub, and there was no contestants, there was no enemy, so they left. The funny part was, after 10 minutes after they left, all the punters that were in the bar prior to them arriving suddenly turned up and came back. They'd all run out of the pub and were hiding down the road round the corner. And when they saw them disappear, they all returned. I won't carry on with stories, but that's essentially what the Duke was like. Do I miss it? Yes. You can't do anything for 20 years without missing a part of it. And once again, I'd just like to thank all the customers that supported us in those early years. I could name names, and probably a lot of them I will have forgotten and can't bring to mind, but just a few. Lee Gray, Mike Penwarden, Gav and Jace Bridle, Alec Frost, Mark Dory. These were a gang of lads that my two sons knew and went to school with, so as soon as they heard that their father and mother had bought a pub, the pub was packed from dawn to dusk. And the more people you have in a pub, the more people you'll get. That's the principle of running a pub, I think. But also, I think pubs these days tend not to engage with their customers. They stick someone behind the bar, and they think the only deal with running a pub is pulling up a pint. We never did that. Lee, my son, was the master of the put down and the reply, and anybody who went to the Duke in those days will certainly remember Lee and his response to customers and the banter and the piss take that went on in there. And so that was a form of entertainment. Sometimes we didn't need a band because there was enough talk and entertainment from one side of the bar to the other to satisfy many, many customers. I'm trying to think of anything else. This will be edited, so some of it or a lot of it will not be recorded, but I'll just remember a few things. Despite popular opinion, I think the Duke was very popular in those days, and the problem was that the council and the police couldn't understand why it was that it was so packed, and we used to get 200, 300 people in there at a time. And so the police gave us a lot of difficulties. And the reason I mention this is that it seems to me that there are probably, that I've been told that there are still complaints about the Duke. This is nothing new. We had it for 20 years, and I can only say that by and large the council supported us. We were threatened with losing our licence from the police many times. I had to confront the police at the council offices where they presented me with 13 charges of the reasons why we shouldn't have a licence. And although I say it myself, there was not one of the issues that they raised were they able to sustain. So we continued with our licence. Even now, many times people come in here and they say they were so pleased that the Duke existed for their children to be able to come down to a pub which they thought was safe. And I think it's quite something to be able to say that many of the youngsters that went there in those days ended up meeting their husbands and wives, and I suppose, and I know for a fact that some of the kids that came about through the relationships that developed down there now use the Duke. I can only say that I'm really glad that the legacy of the Duke has been continued. It's still a music pub, and I think it could only possibly operate as a music pub. We've got enough bistros and pubs that rely on booze, on food, and a sort of anonymity from the people behind the bar. We always tried to create a relationship with people, and I think that's what people want. They want people. They don't want plasma televisions with racing cars going around all the time. They don't just want food. They want entertainment, and the best entertainment you can have in the pub are the people in there. So I could go on for a long time about memories about the Duke. Obviously we had difficult times, but in 20 years there wasn't too many fights, in fact very few, and it was generally a pub where there was a lot of humour and a lot of comradeship really among all the people. I always got the impression that everybody, literally everybody, knew everybody else, and I think by and large that was true, and I think we all, many people still say, do you remember the Duke, you know, in those days. As I say, there was quite a lot of humour down there. I remember one Christmas Eve where Hippie Paul, and if he's listening he'll know this is true, decided that he'd make a pencil copy of the clock with the hands at 9:30, and he stuck it on the clock at 9:30, and we were still serving at 11:30, not realising the hands on the clock weren't going round. So it was that sort of thing. Do you want me to carry on?
Yeah. It's a bit about the music that happened there, if you don't mind. In the 80s.
Oh yes, well,
don't realise.
We were very, very lucky really, because Miller Anderson, who used to play for T-Rex and a number of other bands, began playing there when he moved to Shoreham, and he played every Wednesday for 7 to 10 years. Wednesday night was a spectacular night because nobody quite knew who was going to turn up. Ian Hunter from Mott the Hoople used to come down, and one occasion Mick Ronson, David Bowie's guitarist, came down and played. I can remember vividly the night that Ian Hunter and Mick Ronson were on the stage playing, and it was so packed. It was as packed behind the bar as it was the other side of the bar. You couldn't get anywhere. You couldn't get in. And this was 11:30. They were still banging it out, and everybody was clearing, shouting and screaming, and until someone said the police are outside in cars, and I could see the headlight, the lights flashing outside. Their problem was it was so busy they couldn't get in to do anything about it. So they left, and we never heard anything of it. But we used to have 4 bands a week in general. So we had Miller Wednesday, and then we had Friday, Saturday and Sunday we had bands. Pay homage to our doorman, Barry Wallace, who wasn't a hard man, he wasn't covered with tattoos. He was just a jovial, friendly chap who could talk someone out of being in trouble. And he was a great doorman. We used to charge £1 on the door in the latter days. And the bands were very well paid for that. I don't know whether I should mention amounts, but I'm talking 10 years. Well, we have left the Duke now for 10 years, so it would be 20 years ago, probably. And the bands were getting £300 for a night in those days, which was quite a lot of money. And but there was no rejection, there was no reaction against that. Some of the locals moaned, but we found that was the best way to finance bands, because it's very difficult to pay bands straight out of the till, because there's not enough profit in it in the till, and you can't guarantee the amount of people that are going to come in. If you agree a figure with the band, you can't tell. It might be a quiet night, but in this way they got what was on the door. So if they were successful and they pulled a crowd, they'd get well paid, and vice versa. I remember sitting with Ian Hunter and Mick Ronson after they'd played with Miller Anderson on a Wednesday night right until 1 o'clock in the morning, talking with the two of them. At the time, I didn't really appreciate who I was talking to. I knew that all the kids and all the lads and all the people in the Duke was really sort of well impressed by the fact that Mick Ronson was there and Ian Hunter was there. But I personally, I suppose I was a bit old. Well, I was a bit older in those days, and I tended to lose interest in music when Cliff left the Shadows. So, so it wasn't a great deal. It wasn't a big deal for me. And I remember running Mick Ronson and Ian Hunter home. Ian Hunter used to live along in a long, big white house by the marina at Worthing. They'd had a drink, and we didn't drink behind the bar, not sufficient to be concerned about. And I remember Mick Ronson saying to me, "I will come back and play again." He said, because he said, "I've played to thousands of an audience of thousands and thousands of people." He said, "But it's a totally different experience when you're standing 6 inches away from a crowd of people of 300 and probably more than that, in a pub where," he said, "I began this." And he said, this is sort of going back to my beginnings. So he said to me, "I'm definitely going to come back and play again." Tragically, he died 6 months later of cancer, so I didn't see him again. It's a bit emotional when I speak about that. But anyway, I can't think of much else to say other than we all miss the Duke, and good luck to it in the future. I'm still here in the gallery now. If anybody wants to come in and see me, I'm here. And I'm sure everybody knows that all the pop star pictures that I painted for Round the Duke, there must have been a good 20, possibly more, are all available as prints today from the shop. Glad to see anybody who wants to come and see me. As a lot of people, I take it as quite a compliment that still people come in. Still painting. Still miss the Duke, especially on a Friday night. Met many people in the shop over the years, and as I say, I'm very pleased to have had the shop and also to have had the Duke, because they tended to mesh together and one supported the other. It was a good relationship between the gallery, the shop, the framing, the people that I met in the shop that eventually came down to the Duke. So it was a relationship that was quite supportive, one of the other. And the gentleman who's doing the framing, I don't remember him in the Duke, but he told me just a little while ago that he wanted to buy a Jimi Hendrix picture. Anyway, I can't think of much else to say other than, once again, good luck to the Duke. Don't be too worried about complaints about noise, complaints from various quarters. We've had it for 20 years, and I think the Duke has been a music venue now for 30 years. It has the right to maintain and sustain and be there as an option for people who want a pub that's not just food and plasma tellies, and has got the character of people rather than the character of the corporate world stamped upon it. The Duke is a product of people, not businessmen. So, good luck.